Greetings to all conference participants from London in England. My talk this afternoon is about what I perceive as a diversity deficit in the moral sphere, particularly in the Anglosphere, but also in liberal democratic societies more generally. The work is the product of research conducted with my collaborator Don Trubshaw over a number of years. Our thesis is that a narrowness in the moral perspective of liberal-minded thinkers has, in the last decade or so, led to a skewing of the terms of public moral discourse in favour of two core concerns, kindness and equality. This has led to the marginalisation of the perspective of those of a more conservative or traditionalist disposition. A consequence of this has been the emergence in recent years of a form of cultural hegemony exercised by what we term a new Puritan class, whose religion is an intolerant brand of identity politics based on the division of society into groups of victims and oppressors. So I should start by explaining what we mean by narrowness in liberal thinking. In this, we follow the conclusions of renowned social psychologist and author Jonathan Haidt in his 2012 book, The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Haidt's somewhat surprising discovery based on extensive surveys was that the moral foundations and the set of values prioritized by left-leaning liberals were not so much distinct from those upheld by conservatives, but rather were just more restricted. So, while liberals emphasized the expression of care and kindness and the pursuit of fairness and equality, conservatives were inclined to support additional values, specifically liberty, loyalty, respect for authority, and sanctity. So, liberals tend to support a subset of the wider set upheld by conservatives. Professor Eric Kaufmann, in his recent book, The Third Awakening, also based on extensive survey data, has looked at how this unbalanced perspective of left liberals has led them to disparage moral positions or concepts of virtue derived from religion, patriotism, or sexual propriety, and at the same time to fetishize their penchant for care, kindness, and for equality of outcome, also known by them as equity, by focusing it specifically on racial and later sexual minorities. This has created an unbalanced public morality, the consequences of which we are currently living through. We make the further observation here that since equality is not a virtue, but rather an idea of how society should be organized, kindness stands as the only virtue which is fully acknowledged by left liberals. But there is a problem with focusing on kindness, or indeed on equity, in that this does not, without careful qualification, lead to a coherent moral framework. In particular, there are issues about the direction and the scope of kindness. For example, is receipt of kindness an entitlement or a privilege? Is the demonstration of kindness an obligation? Is everyone equally entitled to be shown kindness? If not, who has priority? And when does kindness become overindulgence? Well, in practice, liberals tend to advocate expressing and withholding kindness selectively, depending on two things. First, group identity, and secondly, perceived historical injustices perpetrated or experienced by said groups. This gives rise in practice to hierarchies of victims who are entitled to kindness and their oppressors who are not. In relation to wrongs, present or historical, perpetrated against sacralized identity groups based on race and sexuality or gender, Kaufmann has claimed we are taught to feel warm and protective emotions towards the descendants of those wronged by these episodes, or to those who look like people who were wronged, and anger and hostility toward the descendants of those who did wrong, or those who look like those who did wrong. The attempted enforcement of such selective kindness through social hegemony is what Kaufman, in his 2024 book, calls cultural socialism. Yascha Mounk, on the other hand, has called this same phenomenon the identity trap in his 2023 book of the same name. So, what is the wider social impact of all this? Well, first of all, why does cultural socialist ideology appear to permeate almost all public moral discourse at the present time? 2 points can be made. First, ideologically captured institutions, particularly in the fields of education, civil service or administration, regulatory control, and even increasingly in business, these institutions exercise hegemony in this space. Secondly, the risks to dissenters, those who don't bow to the cultural socialist hegemony, are asymmetrically experienced. Your social status can be seriously impaired and your career destroyed for little gain if you go against it. So why risk challenging this cultural socialist hegemony? Next, do people really believe in this stuff, you might ask? Or are people just behaving as if they do, owing to social pressure, advantage that can be obtained by going along with it, harm that might be experienced if you don't? Well, Kaufman in his 2024 book has found evidence that employees who have been subjected to cultural socialist hegemony in the workplace do tend to be led to adopt its imposed values and culture as if it were their own in relation to the workplace. So, why does such a phenomenon occur? Well, let's dig down a little deeper and we'll explore how the hegemony works in practice. To make progress, we have to think about the question how we decide what is right in the first place. My starting point in this discussion is that, contrary to the commonly held belief, it is not the case that we rationalize our beliefs of right and wrong from first principles. It's too hard work. It's just impossible to do that in practice. So rather, we infer a framework from observing how things work in society. And we do this from the time that we are a child. We take into consideration the moral arguments expressed by others and work things out on that basis. So rather than being rational in the way that we decide things, we employ our rationality mainly in deciding who or what we will trust as authoritative. And having made that decision, we tend to run with it. Beyond that, our moral framework evolves only gradually, in line with that of our peers. And that, to a large degree, is how morality works. So, as an example of this, Lukyanov and Haidt, in their 2015 paper entitled "The Coddling of the American Mind," found evidence of how, on US campuses, a self-perpetuating punitive microculture of vindictive protectiveness has emerged. In the first instance, there is an excessive, what they describe as an excessive sensitivity of students to microaggressions, or indeed to any language which is deemed offensive. And there are consequences if you are deemed to have used such offensive language. The result is that everyone has to think twice before speaking up, lest they face charges of insensitivity, aggression, or worse. Applebaum in a 2021 article and Doyle in a 2022 book of the same name have called this phenomenon the new Puritanism. The result of this is a hollowing out of the public moral discourse. A bias in liberal values towards kindness and equality, such as we have already described, results in a public moral discourse which is skewed towards arguments based on these principles, i.e., the moral virtues upheld by the left specifically. But this skewing is true for both the left and the right, which means that there is a delegitimization of traditional authority. Those who uphold the conservative values and modes of valuings are therefore increasingly privatized, marginalized, and even problematized, as all moral discourse in the public domain tends to be carried out in terms of whether it promotes kindness and/or equality. So, as with the 17th century Puritans, and indeed with 20th century communist and other authoritarian regimes, their hegemony has a chilling effect on free speech. Inefficiencies as a result of this then arise from the resultant absence of viewpoint diversity, also known as groupthink, and ultimately social and economic progress are held back rather than being promoted, which limits the scope in turn for progress, prosperity, and for peaceful coexistence in our society. So, their conclusion. While some would suggest that a backlash against cultural socialism is already happening, in particular with the rise of Donald Trump and his installation as President of the United States, we believe there remains a long way to go to address the current imbalance. However, an important first step in any pushback against the hegemony of cultural socialism is in recognizing and publicizing the means by which this hegemony is being exercised. There needs to be a reclaiming of corporations, national institutions, and regulatory bodies which have been ideologically captured and have become vehicles for the pursuit and promotion of cultural socialist agendas. And if greater common ground is to be found between liberals and conservatives, it is, we suggest, the conservatives who must establish it and look to defend it, challenging the liberals' monopoly on the idea of what constitutes kindness and enriching it by offering a more diverse palette of values and virtues, so allowing a more inclusive moral discourse. Thank you for your attention. I think we have time now for some questions.